The morning Jonah Clayton placed an advertisement for a wife in the Denver Post. 3 horses died on his ranch within the hour. Coincidence, he told himself, watching the vultures circle overhead. But as he stood in the dust-choked yard of the Silver Creek Ranch, his weathered hands gripping the crumpled newspaper, Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that even the land itself was conspiring against him. T32. He possessed everything a man in 1882 Colorado could want. 10,000 acres of prime cattle country, a sprawling ranch house that rivaled the governor's mansion, and enough gold in the Denver bank to buy half the territory. Yet for all his wealth, Jonah Clayton was the loneliest man in 3 counties. Another telegram, boss. Axel Langley, his foreman, approached with the careful gait of a man delivering bad news. The leather-faced cowhand had worked Silver Creek for 15 years, watching Jonah transform from an optimistic young rancher into something harder, more brittle. From that matrimonial agency back east. Jonah snatched the yellow paper. Regret. TO inform you Miss Pemberton has accepted another proposal. Stop. Will continue search. Stop. Agency fee required for additional correspondence. Stop. The 4th rejection this month. They can smell the curse on you from 2,000 miles away. Axel muttered, then caught Jonah's sharp look. Sorry, boss. Just saying what folks are thinking. The curse. 3 years ago, Jonah wouldn't have given such superstitious nonsense a moment's consideration. But 3 years ago, his bride-to-be hadn't died of fever the week before their wedding. 3 years ago, his prize bull hadn't broken its neck the day he'd announced his engagement to the banker's daughter. 3 years ago, hail hadn't destroyed his crops every time he'd so much as looked sideways at an eligible woman. Now, even the saloon girls in town crossed themselves when he walked by. Any word from the hands about the South pasture? Jonah asked, desperate to change the subject. Carson Blair rode out at dawn. Should be back by. Axel's words were cut short by the thunder of hoofbeats. Carson came tearing into the yard, his horse lathered with sweat and eyes wild with panic. The young cowboy nearly tumbled from his saddle, stumbling toward them with the urgency of a man bearing terrible news. Boss, Carson gasped, hat fallen in the dust behind him. The water, the whole South Creek's gone dry. Bone dry, like it ain't seen rain in years. Impossible. That creek had run strong through every drought Jonah could remember. His father had built the ranch around that water source, calling it the most reliable in the territory. When did you first notice? Jonah's voice came out steady, though his chest felt tight as a fist. This morning, maybe an hour after sunrise. But boss, Carson's voice dropped to a whisper. Old Esme Holloway was down by the creek when it happened. Says she saw the water just disappear, like something sucked it right up from beneath. Esme Holloway, the Creek Indian woman who lived in the hills and occasionally traded herbs with the ranch hands. Some called her a medicine woman. Others used less charitable terms. But Jonah had always found her predictions unervingly accurate. What else did she say? Despite himself, Jonah found himself leaning forward. Carson glanced nervously at Axel, then back to his boss. She said the land's rejecting you. Says it won't accept your prosperity until you accept your destiny. Destiny? Jonah spat in the dust. What kind of destiny involves dying alone on 10,000 acres of cursed ground? But as if summoned by his words, another rider appeared on the horizon. This one moved at a more measured pace. A woman riding side saddle, her dark traveling dress a stark silhouette against the morning sun. Behind her, a loaded wagon creaked along, driven by what looked like a middle-aged woman in practical clothes. The rider drew closer, and Jonah felt something shift in the air around him. The oppressive weight that had settled over the ranch seemed to lift just slightly. The vultures overhead cried once and wheeled away toward the mountains. She was perhaps 25, with hair the color of autumn leaves and skin pale as morning mist. But it was her eyes that held him, deep green, like the heart of an old forest, and filled with a quiet strength that seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed walls. Mr. Clayton? Her voice carried a slight accent he couldn't place, something Eastern, refined, but with rough edges that spoke of recent hardship. I'm Mabel Drummond. I believe you placed an advertisement for a wife. Axel audibly gasped. Carson crossed himself. Even the horses seemed to fall silent. Jonah stared at her. This woman who'd appeared like an answer to a prayer he hadn't dared pray. In the distance, he could swear he heard the faint sound of running water. Impossible, since Carson had just reported the creek dry as bone. Miss Drummond, he managed, tipping his hat. I wasn't expecting anyone. A smile ghosted across her lips, sad, knowing, perhaps a little desperate. No one ever expects me, Mr. Clayton. That tends to be the problem. She dismounted with practiced grace, and as her boots touched the dusty earth of Silver Creek Ranch, Jonah could have sworn he felt the ground itself exhale, like it had been holding its breath for years. But what he couldn't have known was that Mabel Drummond carried her own shadows, and in her worn traveling bag lay a letter that would change everything he thought he understood about curses, destiny, and the true price of love. The woman driving Mabel's wagon turned out to be Nia Rhodes, a former schoolteacher from Boston whose sharp eyes missed nothing and whose tongue could flay a man at 20 paces. She climbed down from the driver's seat with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. Miss Drummond requires lodging for the evening, Nia announced, brushing dust from her practical brown dress. Separate quarters, naturally, until such time as you've made your intentions clear. Jonah found himself nodding, though he hadn't intended to agree to anything yet. There was something about Mabel Drummond that made ordinary thoughts scatter like leaves. In a windstorm, she stood quietly beside her wagon, hands folded, watching him with those unsettling green eyes. Axel, have the men prepare the guest quarters in the main house, Jonah heard himself saying, and see that Miss Rhodes has everything she needs. As his foreman hurried away, muttering under his breath about trouble in a traveling dress, Jonah turned back to his unexpected visitor. Up close, he could see the careful mending in her dark wool dress, the slight hollow in her cheeks that spoke of too many missed meals, the way her gloved hands trembled almost imperceptibly. Whatever had brought Mabel Drummond to his doorstep, it hadn't been prosperity. "You've traveled a long way," he said, gesturing toward the house. "Please, come inside. We can discuss arrangements over supper." But as they walked toward the sprawling ranch house, Carson came running from the south pasture, his face flushed with excitement and confusion. "Boss, you ain't gonna believe this, but that creek, it's running again, strong as ever, like it never went dry at all." Jonah stopped so abruptly that Mabel nearly collided with him. He turned to study her face, searching for any sign of surprise or guilt, but she merely raised one auburn eyebrow, as if mysterious water resurrections were perfectly commonplace. "Curious timing," she murmured. "Indeed." Jonah's voice carried a new edge. "Miss Drummond, perhaps you'd care to explain exactly why you're here? Because in my experience, when strange things start happening around a woman, there's usually more to the story than a simple matrimonial advertisement." For the first time since her arrival, Mabel's composure cracked slightly. Her fingers worried at the worn fabric of her reticule, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "People in my last town called me cursed, Mr. Clayton. Said I brought bad luck to anyone who got close to me." She lifted her chin with defiant pride. "3 engagements broken, 2 by death, 1 by a man who fled in the night after his cattle took sick. I hoped that perhaps your advertisement was placed by someone who might understand what it means to be marked by misfortune." The honesty in her voice hit Jonah like a physical blow. Here was a woman who understood the weight of whispers, the sting of crossed fingers and averted gazes. For the first time in 3 years, he felt less alone. "What kind of sickness struck his cattle?" he asked quietly. "Anthrax. Wiped out half his herd in 2 weeks." Mabel's voice grew smaller. The surviving animals refused to graze where the dead ones had fallen, left perfect circles of dead grass that lasted through 3 seasons. They'd reached the wide porch of the ranch house, but neither moved toward the door. Around them, the late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber. In the distance, Jonah could hear his men working, their voices carrying across the range with renewed energy he hadn't heard in months. "And yet," he said carefully, "my creek runs again for the first time in days. My men sound happier than they have all season. My horses—" He paused, listening. From the corral came the sound of gentle nickering, contentment rather than the restless anxiety that had plagued his livestock for weeks. "Perhaps," Mabel said, her eyes meeting his with startling directness, "what some call a curse, others might call a reckoning." A demand for honesty in a world full of pretty lies. Before Jonah could respond, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Reed Mercer, the territory's federal marshal, rode into the yard with the urgency of a man bearing official business. Behind him came two deputized townsmen, their faces grim beneath their hat brims. Reed Mercer had always been a fair man, but he wore his authority like armor, and today that armor gleamed with uncomfortable purpose. "Jonah," Mercer said, touching his hat brim in greeting. His eyes flicked to Mabel, and something cold passed across his features. "Mississippi, I wonder if I might have a word." "Of course," Jonah replied, though every instinct screamed danger. "What brings you out to Silver Creek?" "Reports of a woman traveling under suspicious circumstances. Maybe you've seen her. Auburn hair, green eyes, traveling with an older woman companion." Mercer's hand rested casually on his gun belt. "Goes by the name Mabel Drummond, though we have reason to believe that might not be her real name." The world seemed to hold its breath. Jonah could feel Mabel tense beside him, could hear Neo Rhodes' sharp intake of breath from the wagon. In the distance, clouds were gathering on the horizon, not the gentle gray of afternoon rain, but the ominous black of a coming storm. "What she wanted for?" Jonah asked, his voice steady despite the churning in his gut. "3 counts of fraud, 1 of theft, and—" Mercer paused, his eyes never leaving Mabel's pale face. "1 count of suspected murder in the town of Deadridge, 200 miles north of here." The words hit like bullets. Jonah felt the careful hope that had been building in his chest shatter into 1,000 sharp pieces. Beside him, Mabel had gone still as death, her hands clutched so tightly around her reticule that her knuckles showed white through her gloves. "There's been a mistake," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Has there?" Mercer stepped closer, his deputies flanking him. "Because Silas Hartwell's widow swears you poisoned her husband with some kind of herb concoction. Says you seduced him into changing his will, then fed him something that stopped his heart cold." Thunder rumbled overhead, though minutes before the sky had been clear. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the span of a heartbeat, and Jonah's horses began whinnying in distress from the corral. "Mr. Clayton," Mabel said quietly, not taking her eyes off the marshal, "I need you to know that whatever you're about to hear, whatever evidence they think they have—" But before she could finish, the black leather portfolio fell from her reticule, spilling its contents across the porch, including a signed confession that would damn them both. The confession scattered across the weathered porch boards like autumn leaves, each page a damning testament written in careful feminine script. But as Jonah bent to retrieve them, his eyes caught something that made his blood run cold. Not Mabel's supposed crimes, but his own name, repeated across multiple documents in handwriting he recognized. "Well, I'll be damned," Marshal Mercer breathed, snatching up the nearest page. "Looks like our little murderess kept detailed records." But Mabel was faster. With movements born of desperation, she lunged forward and gathered half the papers before anyone could stop her, clutching them against her chest like a shield. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "Those aren't confessions, they're evidence. Evidence of what really happened in Deadridge, and why I had to run." "Evidence of what?" Jonah demanded, torn between the growing storm overhead and the storm brewing in his own chest. Around them, his ranch hands had begun to gather. Drawn by the commotion and the increasingly unnatural weather, Mabel's eyes darted between the marshal and Jonah, calculating odds, weighing truths against consequences. Finally, she held out one of the papers, not to Mercer, but to Jonah. "Read it," she whispered. "Please. Before you let them take me away, just read what your brother wrote." The world tilted. Jonah stared at her, certain he'd misheard. "My brother's been dead for 5 years." "Has he?" Mabel's laugh held no humor. "Because Lucas Clayton was very much alive 6 months ago when he hired me to seduce and murder you." The confession fell from Jonah's nerveless fingers. Around him, the gathered ranch hands murmured in shock, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. Lucas, his younger brother, his partner, the man who died in a mine collapse outside Denver. The man whose funeral Jonah had paid for, whose debts he'd settled, whose memory he'd honored for half a decade. "That's impossible," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, pieces were falling into place. The timing of his streak of bad luck, The precision with which misfortune had struck every potential romantic relationship. The way his business deals had soured just often enough to keep him from expanding beyond Colorado territory. Show him. The letters, Miss, Nia Rhodes said quietly. She'd climbed down from the wagon and now stood with her arms crossed, glaring at Marshall Mercer. Show him what that snake brother of his has been planning. With trembling hands, Mabel extracted a bundle of correspondence from her remaining papers. The handwriting was unmistakably Lucas's. Jonah recognized the elaborate L's and the way his brother dotted his I's with little circles, a habit their mother had tried unsuccessfully to break. "My dear Miss Drummond," the first letter began, "I trust this correspondence finds you in desperate enough circumstances to consider my proposition. As discussed, my brother Jonah possesses considerable wealth that rightfully should have been divided between us. His untimely demise would correct this oversight, provided it appears sufficiently natural. Son of a bitch," Axel breathed, reading. Over Jonah's shoulder. "Pardon the language, miss, but your brother's a special kind of bastard." The storm overhead had grown violent, with lightning forking across the sky in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Wind whipped across the ranch yard, sending dust devils spiraling toward the mountains. But Jonah barely noticed the weather. His entire world had narrowed to the pages in his hands. Pages that detailed Lucas's plan to fake his own death, establish a new identity, and systematically destroy Jonah's chances at happiness while positioning himself to inherit everything. "The mining accident," Jonah said slowly. "The body they found wasn't Lucas," Mabel confirmed. "He paid some drifter to wear his clothes and jewelry, then caused a cave-in that made identification impossible. Your brother's been living in Deadridge under the name Silas Hartwell, building a new life while planning your destruction." Marshall Mercer, who'd been reading his own collection of papers with increasing discomfort, finally spoke up. "Miss Drummond, these documents, if they're authentic, they change everything. But why didn't you take them to the law in Deadridge?" Mabel's laugh was bitter as desert wind. "Because Lucas, Silas, had half the town in his pocket. The sheriff was his drinking partner. The judge owed him money. When I tried to expose him after he propositioned me, they branded me a madwoman and issued warrants for my arrest." "So, you ran," Jonas said, understanding beginning to dawn. "But why come here? Why not just disappear?" For the first time since her arrival, Mabel's composure completely cracked. Tears she'd been holding back for months spilled down her cheeks, and when she spoke, her voice was raw with exhaustion and desperate hope. "Because I fell in love with you through his letters," she whispered. "Lucas showed me his correspondence with you, thinking it would help me understand your character so I could manipulate you better. But the man who wrote those letters, who worried about his workers' families, who sent money to the church for the poor, who blamed himself for tragedies that weren't his fault, that man deserved to know the truth." Thunder crashed directly overhead, so loud it shook the windows of the ranch house. But in that moment of nature's violence, Jonah felt something inside him settle into perfect stillness. The pieces of his broken life were rearranging themselves into a new pattern, one that made terrible sense. "The curse," he said quietly. "It was never supernatural. It was Lucas sabotaging me from the shadows. Every potential bride, every business deal, every stroke of bad luck," Mabel confirmed. "He had confederates in Denver, people who owed him favors or feared his threats. Your mail was intercepted, your romantic interests were warned away or paid to reject you. Your livestock was poisoned just enough to seem like natural misfortune." Carson stepped forward, hat in hand, his young face twisted with anger. "Boss, if this is true, what do we do?" Before anyone could answer, a new sound cut through the storm, the drumming of hoofbeats approaching at a gallop. But these riders came from the direction of town, and they rode with the urgency of men bearing terrible news. The lead rider pulled up in a spray of mud and dismounted before his horse had fully stopped. It was Tom Bradley, owner of the Deadridge Bank, his usually immaculate suit torn and stained with travel. "Marshall Mercer," Bradley gasped, stumbling toward them. "Thank God you're here. There's been a murder in Deadridge. Silas Hartwell's been found dead in his study, shot through the heart. But here's the strange part. Right before he died, he confessed everything to his housekeeper. About faking his death, about being Lucas Clayton, about trying to have his brother killed. The silence that followed was broken only by the rumble of thunder and the sharp intake of Mabel's breath. When Mercer demanded, 3 days ago, Bradley replied. Same day this lady would have been traveling towards Silver Creek. All eyes turned to Mabel, who stood frozen in the swirling wind, her traveling dress whipping around her like dark wings. But what none of them could have anticipated was the sound of slow, mocking applause coming from the shadows of the barn, and the familiar voice that followed, speaking words that would shatter everything they thought they knew about life, death, and the true nature of revenge. The applause came slow and deliberate, each clap echoing across the storm-lashed yard like gunshots. From the shadows of the barn stepped a figure that made Jonah's blood turn to ice water in his veins. Lucas Clayton, very much alive, very much amused, and pointing a rifle at his brother's heart. "Bravo, dear Mabel," Lucas drawled, his voice carrying that familiar lazy confidence that had charmed their way out of trouble as boys and into it as men. "Though I must say, your performance would have been more convincing if you'd managed a few tears when describing your tragic love affair with my correspondents." He looked exactly as Jonah remembered, tall and lean, with their father's sharp cheekbones and their mother's dark eyes. But there was something new in his face, a cruelty that hadn't been there 5 years ago, carved deep by whatever darkness he'd been living in. Lucas. The name left Jonah's lips like a prayer and a curse combined. "You son of a bitch." Now, brother. That's no way to greet family." Lucas stepped into the full light of the storm, keeping his rifle trained on the group. Especially family who's taken such pains to orchestrate this touching reunion. Marshal Mercer's hand moved toward his gun, but Lucas sked disapprovingly. "I wouldn't, Marshal. You see, I have men positioned around the ranch house with orders to start shooting at the first sign of heroics. And while I'd hate for anyone to get hurt unnecessarily, I'm afraid this conversation is long overdue." As if summoned by his words, dark figures materialized from behind various outbuildings, at least 6 armed men, all with rifles trained on the group in the yard. Jonah recognized none of them, but their coordinated positioning spoke of military training and careful planning. "The man in Deadridge," Mabel said, her voice steady despite the rifle pointed at her chest. "Who did you kill?" Lucas's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Poor Harold Gibbs. A drifter, much like the one who took my place in that mine shaft 5 years ago. Amazing how easy it is to find desperate men willing to wear another man's clothes for the promise of a warm meal." His eyes glittered with malicious humor. Of course, Harold thought he was just playing a prank on the local law. He had no idea he'd be taking a bullet to sell the illusion of my death. "You're insane," Jonah breathed. "Am I? Or am I simply more committed to getting what's mine than you ever gave me credit for?" Lucas's voice hardened. "Do you know what it's like, Jonah, watching your older brother inherit everything simply by accident of birth? Father's approval, the family ranch, the respect of everyone in the territory, all of it handed to you while I got scraps and second chances." The storm overhead seemed to respond to Lucas's anger, lightning splitting the sky in violent bursts. But Jonah barely noticed the weather. His mind was racing, calculating distances, counting enemies, searching for any advantage in an impossible situation. "So you decided to take it," Jonah said, buying time. "By destroying everything I cared about. By making you understand loss," Lucas corrected. "Every failed courtship, every sick animal, every drought and disaster. All of it designed to hollow you out the same way I was hollowed out. I wanted you to know what it felt like to be truly alone." Mabel stepped forward, seemingly oblivious to the rifle trained on her. "And what about me, Lucas? Was I just another tool in your revenge?" "Oh, my dear Miss Drummond." Lucas's voice took on a mocking gentleness. "You were to be the masterpiece, the final betrayal that would break my brother completely. You would seduce him, marry him, and then, once he'd learned to trust again, to hope again, you would destroy him from within." "But she didn't," Axel said suddenly, his weathered face twisted with realization. "She came here to warn him instead." Lucas's smile faltered for the first time. "Yes, that was unexpected, which is why I had to accelerate my timeline." His eyes locked on Mabel's with genuine curiosity. "Tell me what changed. You were so agreeable in our early correspondence, so eager for the money I promised." Mabel raised her chin with defiant pride. "I read his letters to you. The real ones. not the business correspondence you showed me. I saw what kind of man your brother really was. Honorable, generous, kind. Everything you pretended to be, but never were. The truth of it hit Lucas like a physical blow. For a moment, his carefully constructed composure cracked, revealing the wounded boy beneath the vengeful man. Kind, he repeated bitterly. Yes, Jonah was always kind. Kind when he beat me at cards. Kind when father chose him over me. Kind when he inherited everything while I got nothing but empty promises and hollow sympathy. You got your share, Jonah said quietly. I made sure of it. Half of everything, just like father wanted. Half of what you thought I deserved. Lucas's voice rose to a roar that competed with the thunder. Never what I actually earned, never what I was worth. Always Jonah's gracious charity, Jonah's magnanimous generosity. Do you know how it feels to be pitted by someone you're supposed to be equal to? In that moment, Jonah saw his brother clearly. For the first time, not as the charming rogue of his memories, but as a man consumed by resentment so deep it had poisoned everything good in him. So what now? Jonah asked. You kill me and take over the ranch? Pretend to be the grieving brother returning from the dead? Oh, nothing so crude, Lucas said, his composure returning. No, I've planned something much more poetic. You see, in about 10 minutes, a group of masked bandits is going to attack this ranch. Tragically, everyone present will be killed defending your honor, including your beloved fiancée, Miss Drummond. I, of course, will arrive just in time to discover the carnage and inherit what's left. As if on cue, the sound of approaching horses reached them through the storm. But these riders came from multiple directions, surrounding the ranch with military precision. Reed Mercer cursed under his breath. How many men do you have, Lucas? Enough, Lucas replied, though I prefer to think of them as investors in justice. But as the riders drew closer, Jonah noticed something that made his heart leap with desperate hope. Mixed in with the thunder of hoofbeats was another sound, the distant howl of wolves, growing closer with each passing second. And from the hills beyond the ranch, a new voice called out through the storm, strong and clear and somehow familiar. The land remembers, Lucas. Clayton, the land remembers its own. Lucas's face went white as bone. That's impossible. The old woman died years ago. But Esme Holloway stepped into the circle of lamplight, her weathered face serene despite the chaos around them. And behind her came, not wolves, but every rancher, cowhand, and settler within 50 miles, all armed, all grim-faced, all united in purpose. You made one mistake, boy, Esme said quietly, her dark eyes boring into Lucas's soul. You forgot that the land has its own justice. The final reckoning was about to begin, and in the eye of the storm, with death closing in from all sides, Jonah Clayton was about to discover that some curses can only be broken by the willing sacrifice of everything you hold dear. The standoff lasted exactly 17 heartbeats. Jonah counted them, each one echoing like thunder in his chest. Then Lucas made his fatal mistake. He looked away from his brother to gauge the approaching riders, and in that instant, Mabel Drummond proved that a woman with nothing left to lose could be the most dangerous force on earth. She threw herself sideways into Lucas, spoiling his aim just as his rifle discharged harmlessly into the storm-dark sky. They went down in a tangle of limbs and fury, rolling across the muddy ground as chaos erupted around them. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions, Lucas's hired guns opening up on the approaching settlers, Marshal Mercer and his deputies returning. Fire, Jonah's ranch hands diving for cover behind water troughs and wagon wheels. But through it all, Jonah had eyes only for Mabel, locked in desperate combat with his brother just yards away. The barn, Axel shouted over the gunfire, pointing toward a muzzle flash from the hayloft. Carson, take 3 men and circle around. But Jonah was already moving, not toward cover but toward the writhing figures in the mud. Lucas had gained the upper hand, his hands wrapped around Mabel's throat, his face twisted with rage and madness. You should have taken the money, Lucas snarled. Should have done what you were paid for. Mabel's response was to drive her knee upward with vicious precision. Lucas doubled over with a strangled cry, and suddenly Jonah was there, hauling his brother upright and delivering a punch that had 20 years of accumulated disappointment. Behind it, Lucas staggered backward, blood streaming from his nose, his eyes wide with shock. You always were too soft, Jonah. Too willing to believe the best in people. Maybe, Jonah agreed, stepping protectively in front of Mabel. But at least I never let bitterness poison everything good in my life. Around them, the battle was turning. Esme Holloway's gathered force of settlers and ranchers had surrounded Lucas's hired guns with the quiet efficiency of people who'd spent their lives protecting what was theirs. The storm overhead was beginning to break, letting shafts of late sunlight through the clouds like golden arrows. "It's over, Lucas," Marshal Mercer called out, his gun trained on the remaining outlaws. "Your men are outnumbered 10-1. Surrender now, and maybe we can avoid any more bloodshed." But Lucas Clayton had spent 5 years nurturing his hatred, and he wasn't about to let reason interfere with his revenge. With a wordless cry of rage, he lunged for the dropped rifle, rolling and coming up with the weapon aimed squarely at Jonah's chest. Time crystallized into a perfect, terrible moment. Jonah saw his brother's finger tighten on the trigger, saw the mad determination in eyes that had once been filled with laughter. There was no time to dodge, no time to draw his own weapon, no time for anything except the certain knowledge that his story was about to end in the muddy yard where it had begun. But Mabel was faster than time itself. She stepped between them. Without hesitation, her arms spread wide as if she could shield him with will alone. The rifle cracked like breaking bone, and she folded to the ground with a soft exhalation that somehow carried over all the noise of battle. "No," the word tore from Jonah's throat like something alive and bleeding. He dropped beside her, gathering her into his arms as her blood seeped into the storm-soaked earth. Lucas stared at them both, the rifle trembling in his hands. For a moment, his face showed nothing but horror at what he'd done. Then Marshal Mercer's bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him sprawling. "Get the doc," Axel was shouting. But Doc Morrison was already pushing through the crowd, his medical bag in hand and his face grim with purpose. "How bad?" Jonah whispered, cradling Mabel's head against his chest. Her eyes were still open, still that incredible green, but they were growing dim around the edges. "Bad enough," she murmured, her voice already thready. "But Jonah, listen to me. The land isn't cursed. You aren't cursed. Sometimes the earth just needs to know you're willing to fight for what matters." Around them, the last of the gunfire was dying away. Lucas's hired guns were surrendering or fleeing, and the settlers were helping tend to the wounded. The storm had passed completely now, leaving the air clean and sweet with the scent of rain-washed sage. "Don't you dare leave me," Jonah said, fiercely. "Not now. Not when I've finally found someone worth fighting for." Mabel's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "Then you'd better kiss me, Jonah Clayton, because I've been waiting for that kiss since I read your first letter, and I'll be damned if I'm going to die without knowing what it feels like." He kissed her there in the mud and blood and settling dust, kissed her with all the desperation and hope and love that had been building in his chest since the moment she'd ridden into his cursed life. And when their lips met, something shifted in the air around them. Not magic, exactly, but something deeper and more true. The bullet had missed her heart by inches, Doc Morrison would later discover. The blood loss was serious, but not fatal, and the infection that everyone feared never came. Within a month, Mabel Drummond was walking the halls of the Silver Creek Ranch house as its mistress, and within a year, the sound of children's laughter echoed across land that had known too much silence. Lucas recovered from his wounds in the territorial prison, where he spent his days writing letters that no one ever answered. Some said the solitude finally broke his spirit. Others claimed it gave him time to find whatever goodness had been buried under all that resentment. Either way, he never again troubled the peace of Silver Creek Ranch. The curse, if it had ever truly existed, was broken. Jonah's cattle thrived. His crops grew strong and tall, and his water ran clear and sweet through all seasons. More importantly, he'd learned the difference between superstition and truth, between the random cruelties of life and the deliberate malice of a wounded heart on their wedding day. Exactly 1 year after that storm-torn evening, Mabel stood in the same spot where she'd first dismounted from her horse. But now the yard bloomed with wildflowers that had somehow taken root in what had once been barren earth. Esme Holloway, who'd stayed for the ceremony, claimed the flowers had grown from the blood of sacrifice and the tears of joy. Whether that was true or not, Jonah decided, mattered less than the simple fact that they were there, bright splashes of color in a world that had once seemed determined to drain all the beauty from his life. Any regrets? He asked his wife as they stood watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Mabel smiled, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their first child grew. Only that I didn't come here sooner. In the distance, the creek sang its eternal song, and the land stretched out before them like a promise written in earth and sky and the endless possibility of tomorrow. Well now, if that tale of love conquering curses both real and imagined didn't set your heart to racing, then you might want to check if you still have one beating in your chest. Give this story a like if it stirred something in your soul, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales of romance on the frontier. Speaking of which, we'd love to hear from you. Partner, drop a comment below and let us know where in this wide world you're watching from today.